So we'll get started. Just do a quick set of introductions, and then we'll dive straight in. The first thing is, it's quite intimidating doing a presentation on data mesh when you've got Zhamak kind of somewhere, maybe in this audience, or at least somewhere in the conference. So we'll try and stay on track. My name's Andy Mott. I work at Starburst. I'm the co-author of Data Mesh for Dummies, which is not as good as Zhamak's book. I spend a lot of my time consulting, advising organizations, chief data officers mostly, on how to adopt data mesh, things that they need to consider, people, governance mostly, and some of the technology aspects as well. And I'm joined by Max Schultze.
Hey everyone, I'm Max. I'm a data engineering manager, but most importantly, as for today, I'm here as data mesh advocate as well. I'm also an author of this little nice thing. It's also not as impressive as Zhamak's book, I have to say, but there will be a signing session later on as well at the Starburst booth, so if you want to get your free copy, feel free to drop by there as well.
Cool. So, there we go. So, we're going to sort of talk about today some of our experiences. So, Max is going to talk about his experiences from his organization and their adoption of data mesh. And I'm going to attempt to augment that with some of the things that I've seen and some of the observations that I've made with the different organizations that I've worked in. So this is more kind of some of our real world experience, some of the learnings that we've had of organizations that are maybe 1, 2, or 3 years into their kind of data mesh journey. So before we get into that in any detail, let me try this one. I'm pressing all the buttons and nothing's working. Do we have another thing? Oh, that's perfect. Let's try that. Okay, so one more. So I'm going to do a really quick recap on data mesh. For those that didn't see Zhamak's presentation, I find that it's quite useful just to do a quick level set. So I would suggest that this is what we've been doing for sort of 20, 30, 40 years. Operational systems to run the business. Let's say your bank balance, your amount of data that you've got left each month on your mobile phone contract, the way that you use maybe a basket on a website, and these things generate data. And then over on the other side, we've got this analytical data plane, which is where we put this analytical data, where we are looking at forecasts and trends and MI reporting and BI reporting and all that good stuff. And obviously that needs to be fed with data, which comes through this pipeline or ETL or ELT or CDC or whatever wonderful terms we want to make up this week or month. And fundamentally, we've been doing this for a long time. And these people over here really care about the operations. These people over here, they care about making better business decisions, which they can take in action, and therefore they can make some more money or less cost or reduce risk or whatever it might be. And then in the middle, we have the people who have the worst job in the whole thing, because these guys historically have had to become experts in these technologies, experts in the data models of these technologies, experts in the technologies of the ETL or data pipeline, experts in every part of the business. So what I mean by that is, if we think about the way risk people think about data and the way finance people think about data and marketing think about data, it's very different. And we need to codify that, their thoughts and their approaches to data, we need to codify that in this process. These guys also need to understand the technology of the analytical the analytical technologies that we're using to exploit that data, and also the data models that we need thereafter, and the structures, and again, the codification of business rules. And so that's a lot. And that's why when these guys phone up and say, I need an additional column, or I need some more data, or whatever it may be, they typically raise a ticket with these guys in the middle. Some point in the future, someone does some work, they get a response, they get that data, the business has changed, no one cares, world's moved on, and and that's quite a thankless task in the middle. And so this is really what I would suggest data mesh focuses on. There is one other aspect which we overlook significantly, and I'm kind of going through this as quick as I can because this is a quick recap, is people who run operational systems don't really care about the data, right? And that's understandable. They need to keep the lights on. That's their kind of job. And so it may be really easy for someone over here to switch a switch on an application to generate more data. And so the example I often give here is, if we think about websites, every mouse click, you're going to generate a weblog, right? You're going to generate an entry into a weblog. It may be really easy for us to capture mouse movements. but why would I? Why would I switch that on? There's no incentive or motivation for me to do that over here, but that, let's say we capture mouse movements, that may mean that actually we have an additional data feed, which means we can completely change our website so that the customer journey is more efficient or more effective, or we can generate, you know, uplift in sales. So a lot of people, when they talk about data mesh, are focusing on reactive and moving from kind of this reactive approach to something else, but actually there's also a bunch of missed opportunities that we don't see on the operational side as well. So you may need to press the button again. I'm afraid the clicker's not working. But anyway, so the principles of data mesh. Again, I'm not going to go into this in a lot of detail, but broadly we have people, and we group them into organizational structures. There's an awful lot of literature and material in this space that we can get into about, you know, how we organize people. But fundamentally, we got groups of people who know about a particular aspect of business. They're going to generate data as a product. I've got a quick plug. I'm doing a session tomorrow afternoon, which is all about data as a product. And in the 25 minutes that I've got tomorrow, I will not be able to cover all the aspects of that and how that's different from silos and assets and things. So we're not going to get into that there now. But basically, these people generating these things using some technology which enables them to do the things that they need to do in a simple and easy way with as little friction as possible. And build these data products. And then we have this federated computational governance, again a really big interesting subject, which is really to say that once these data products have been created and made available, we need them to conform to standards, and we need to have some automation around that so that these data products can be used by different people in different ways. And I'll hand over to Max to talk about a real world example of something that he's seen.
Yeah, enough of the theory. Let's dive into actually some real-world examples when it comes to that. And this is an example that I actually witnessed myself in the past. And the situation was the following at that time, that there was a new analyst that joined a team, picking up the responsibility to work on the KPIs of the respective team. Up until that point, the team was always just relying on data that they were producing by themselves. But this was the first time that they actually needed to rely on some data that was produced by another team. So that analyst got pointed towards another team that was supposed to be producing this data. They reached out to that team, took them a week to actually get a response, and the response that they got was that this team is not responsible for this data. And well, it took them another week to even get a second response of having them again tell them that they don't even know whom to forward them to. So, fresh job, new company, 2 weeks in and you're already stuck. Amazing. They learned that there was a central infrastructure team that might be able to actually help them out on this case particularly. So they reached out to the central data infrastructure team, and it took them 2 weeks to actually get back to them and to respond, because, as Andy pointed out, central infrastructure teams are usually completely overloaded with all sorts of requests. But eventually they actually got a chance to sit down with them, and they were able to help them, and they were able to figure out what is the data that they were looking for. Turns out it was exactly the same data that they were looking for in the first place. So they went back to this very same team that already rejected the ownership about this data, and well, they did some deeper investigation. They realized, well, unfortunately, yes, they are responsible for that, but there was only one person that knew about the service that was generating that data, and they had just left the company. So this is just one of very few examples on like what is going wrong each and every day when it comes to working with data, right? But what we now want to get towards is, well, how can we actually fix that, right? How can we get started? How can we address these issues? And the first thing that I really would like to get into is we want to get the people to care. We want them to actually understand the different perspectives, because ultimately we have all the three players that Andy originally introduced in this example, right? We have a data consumer, we have a data producer, and we have the infrastructure team in the middle. But none of them, up until that point, really understood what each other are doing. And this is exactly what we need to change. We need to actually build up some empathy, because yes, the analysts in our example here, they had a really hard time. They were really suffering to actually get their job done. But did the producing team do that on purpose? No, definitely not. They were not acting out of bad faith or anything like that. And it's important to understand that this very team, of course, also has an overloaded roadmap. They have a lot of things to do. Even worse, they just lost an engineer in their team that was supposed to contribute to that roadmap. So understanding their perspective as well is super important to not start picking up a blame game or like doing finger pointing or anything like that, but to actually understand how can we continue to collaborate in the future. And the same comes true for the infrastructure team as well, right? Again, it took 2 weeks to actually get the possibility to sit with them. And ultimately, a problem that took 4 weeks to solve was actually solved in 10 minutes, right? But again, we need to understand they were as overloaded because they get all these requests, not just from this particular analyst, but from all the different business units. So it's super important to understand the different perspectives and to build up the empathy so that you can understand how can you best collaborate with those teams also in the future. And then the next big thing is to actually create incentives for them to help you moving forward, right? And there's plenty different options that you actually have when it comes to that. I personally love to talk about social incentivization, right? Giving shout outs to the teams that you depend on, actually praising them in your public announcement where you're talking about the new metric, the new feature that you have published. Shout out your dependencies, even if it was a hard journey to actually get there. If you mark them as somebody that contributed, and let's be honest, you wouldn't have been able to complete your job without them, this actually creates very positive incentives to move these people forward. Of course, you can also do financial incentivization. That's also something that is always a possibility, especially in bigger companies, when it comes to, well, you have an overloaded team. Maybe you want to make a pitch towards management, explaining what's the value of the new thing that you are adding now, and actually pitch for that team getting a new engineer to fully take up this responsibility. So there's plenty of different opportunities on how you can incentivize people and teams to actually help you out in this situation. But what do we need the people to do? Well, as this picture here shows, we are still in the situation where we are having this central pipelining approach, where we are creating these data silos, where we are creating all the problems because the consumers and the producers are disconnected from each other. And this is really what we need to move away from. This is really the picture that Andy has already drawn out as well. We need to move towards a point where the respective teams are enabled to do the job by themselves. The people that know best about the data that is later on being used by many different teams in the company are the ones that are producing it. Are the people in the respective business domain that have all the knowledge about the data that is actually being used here. And those are the people that also have to pick up the responsibility for actually preparing the data in a way that it's usable as a product, that it is usable in a way that is creating the maximum value for the other teams that depend on that. And this, of course, also means that you need to change the way how you're doing infrastructure. This means that you need to move away from the central teams who are doing all the pipelines towards the part that you actually enable them as platform teams, where you give them all the technical tools that they need to get the job done. Because ultimately you are asking people to pick up additional responsibility, and that also means you need to actually help them to pick that up, because ultimately otherwise it would just lead to teams crumbling under the additional pressure that you're putting onto them. But yeah, Andy, maybe can you showcase a little bit about like how can this actually look like in terms of rollout in the company?
Yes, yeah. So I often get asked, kind of, well, how do we start? Where do we begin with this? And I think there's broadly two approaches. There is the approach that I think works quite well, which is to identify a simple data product. And simple data product is an interesting term. I tend to pick on finance when I'm talking to organizations, and the reason I pick on finance is because finance, as an organization, tends to have fairly self-contained data when we compare it to something like risk or marketing or one of those other functions where they are getting data from lots and lots of different places across the business. So something simple, and then get those guys to build a data product over the course of a period of time. And I typically say sort of 3 months, and the reason for that is because we don't have organizations where people are sat around doing nothing, right? So they're going to have a day job, and what we're asking them to do is typically on top of that in the kind of initial period. And then as part of that, what we want to do is understand all the sort of touch points throughout the rest of the organization that they have to interact with. And we want to learn all those touch points, because what ultimately we want is that domain to be autonomous in creating that data product. And as part of that discussion, or as part of that learning, we also need to think about infrastructure. And by infrastructure, I basically mean technology that we use to sort of organize and orchestrate data. And there's a lot under that, but we'll just call it infrastructure. And so what we kind of see is this adoption of the process of building a data product over a period, understanding those organizational touch points, understanding the infrastructure that's kind of required if it's missing or if it's there. And then at the end of that process, building another data product, and building another data product, and each data product we build, the team becomes more autonomous. And underneath that, we build out the infrastructure capabilities. So, for example, for the first data product, maybe we can get away with immutable data that we can store in an object store. But maybe for the second data product, we discover that actually it's more transactional. So now we need some sort of relational database. We need some sort of relational capability, or some sort of relational capability. And as we go forward with more and more data products, we can see the infrastructure kind of building out. And so this is a kind of what I would call a bottom-up approach. It's very iterative, kind of very organic, and this is where I see most organizations going. However, one of the criticisms of data mesh, and I'm looking for Zhamak, is the fact that if you allow people to do this organically, how do you kind of map that to the organizational KPIs, right? Organizations are in the business of whatever it is to make money, to provide healthcare or to provide insurance or something. There are top level KPIs, and so if we go to the next slide, there's this top-down approach which I've started to see in organizations as well. Now, these things aren't mutually exclusive. You can kind of do a bit of both. You can have direction, and you can have a sort of an organic, iterative approach. But this top-down approach is where we kind of look at the organization and we say, what are the 5 objectives of this company? A certain level of profit, a certain level of number of patients, or number of customers, or whatever it may be. And we do what we've done sort of 20 or 30 years ago, I guess, KPI mapping, or KPI trees we used to call this, where you kind of identify the key KPIs of the business and you find the KPIs that support them and the KPIs that support them, and then that allows us to identify data products that support those KPIs. And then we can start saying, well, who would be responsible for this data product? Well, that's, they sort of sit in that domain. And so, as I said before, these aren't mutually exclusive. We can have kind of direction top down, and we can have bottom up or organic iterative approach. But certainly these two approaches are two that I've started to see in organizations. And again, when I talk to chief data officers, I typically see pictures like this quite early on in that conversation about data mesh. So again, these are just some of the things that we've kind of seen and learned. So that's kind of getting started, and we're whistling through this at a rate of knots. So once we've got started, what do we need to think about next in terms of actually sort of scaling the mesh in terms of more data products, more consumption, etc. So one of the things that is really important is organization, people. Max talked about incentivizing people and creating empathy. And I mentioned about this central data team. One of the things that data mesh sort of espouses is having those technical skills, or those data skills at least, in domains. And so on this slide we can see we've got these 4 domains and we've got a central data team. And actually where we move towards is the central data team functions or roles migrating into domains. And so the domains become more self-sufficient. Now there's a whole bunch of models and discussion behind this. Should we have like initiative or project-based kind of data engineering talent going into a domain? So let's say we've got this project, the data engineers go into a domain, support that project, do the work, and then leave. Or maybe we actually just get rid of the central data team and those people report into marketing or whatever. Or maybe there's a different approach, which is kind of maybe secondment, where we have rotating data engineers rotating through domains. And again, there's a lot of detail we can get into, and this does depend on organizations, but this is something that we need to think about when we think about data mesh. And it's something certainly that's kind of top of mind when people are looking at it from a sort of organizational point of view. So if we go to the next slide, one thing that, again, not in the literature, but one of the learnings we've kind of had is, however you've moved to this picture where you've got your data talent in the domains, actually you end up with this requirement to have some form of central enablement team. And this isn't a team that does, This is a team that provides capabilities for the other domains. So a really simple but concrete example might be that the way we represent a customer, we may have some sort of customer key or some set of customer fields. It may be that what we want to do is have a user-defined function that runs across our platform that says, it takes a number of inputs and produces a key in a particular format. And this central enablement team can build that, and then all of the domains can therefore use it thereafter. The way I think about central enablement teams is a little bit like, or a different perspective, is a little like a personal trainer. So they can come along and they can kind of help you get from the couch to the 5 kilometers, and they can help the domains, be proficient at doing something. And once the domains are proficient at that, then maybe instead of just going from the couch to 5 kilometers, maybe you want to do some sort of other exercise. I'm not an exercise person. And basically they're there to sort of train you in that as well. So over time the domains get much more self-sufficient, and this enablement team isn't a doing team, it's an enabling team. Again, not in the literature, but just something that we've seen sort of pop up in organizations to help move towards and scale the data mesh over time. So this is a very busy slide, and this is because I wanted to try and keep the number of slides short, so I just put lots more things on this. So when we think about that third pillar, the self-service infrastructure pillar, there's a lot in there, and really we need to think about the capabilities that we want to give to the domains for them to do the work they need to do. More importantly, we want to think about the capabilities we give to the domains that allow them to do the work in the easiest way with the least friction and kind of knowing the least about the technology. Someone in marketing should not and does not care that their data lives in some object store somewhere, or their data is in this particular table format in this particular relational database or this cloud data warehouse, right? And they don't care that this data is being synced or moved around. What they care about is the data. And so when I say about least friction, that's really what I'm trying to get across. We need to start thinking about removing technology knowledge and cognitive load from the domains and get them to focus on data. So these are some of the things that I think are important. Things like access control, security, the standard governance stuff that we've had over time, things like CI/CD, things like giving domains the ability to start compute and access storage, but without having to really know that that's kind of what they're doing under the covers. The one that I will call out though is usage metrics. One of the things that I think is most important when we think about technologies for data mesh is usage metrics. And the reason for this is because Max mentioned this earlier, incentivization, right? If we're incentivizing people, we need to know, we need to have some form of measure. And Max mentioned financial incentives. I know a number of organizations today that have moved towards a data mesh that actively give money to their data engineers in their domains based on the number of usages of their data products on a monthly basis. So if 100 people, or there's 100 queries or whatever against this particular data product, these people get paid more than if there was only 10. Suddenly that introduces a whole set of different motivation around the way we think about data into companies. But to do that, we need to know who's using the data, how often they're using it. And I would go further and say what they're doing with the data. If you've got 90% of your users of your data product, the first thing they do is sort the data, maybe you should have a new data product which has sorted data. Really simple example. But now we're kind of, this starts getting into that empathy, understanding what people are doing, and trying to make their lives as easy as possible for kind of downstream consumption of data products. We'll go on to the next slide. So, when I think about selecting infrastructure components that go in a data mesh, and let's say we were in an organization that didn't have any tech and we were starting from scratch, which is not the case ever, but let's say we were, in my opinion, from the discussions and the thinking and the literature and the experience with organizations, the most important thing about choosing technologies is interoperability, right? And what I mean by that is we may have a number of compute engines. Obviously I've put Starburst in there, but we may have Spark for machine learning, we may have Kafka, we may have some sort of API tool that allows us to access data for different requirements for different domains. Underneath those, we're going to need things like a data catalog, right? People need to be able to find and discover data products. Doesn't matter what engine they're using, but they need to be able to find data. It doesn't matter what engine we're using, we need to have the same security roles, right, across the data. If I'm coming in through a SQL interface, I should only see the same data as if I'm accessing it through a machine learning interface. There should be no difference. So having sort of common technologies down here which are able to be used by all the compute platforms is kind of really important. And I've put Hive Metastore up there. The reason I've done that is because, you know, all the cloud vendors, they pretty much have a Hive Metastore, be it or a derivation of it, be it Glue or Purview or you know, the Thrift service in Google Dataproc. So I think this is a reasonably good thing to kind of standardize on. There may be others. If we think about that for a moment, though, why I say this. If we didn't have this, if we had, thank you, 2 metadata stores, let's say, for technical metadata, say I had a closed environment where I put all my data into it and I had metadata in there, and I had another compute engine, how would I manage this? What we would typically do is kind of have some sort of synchronization between that closed system and the other system. The question is, who in the data mesh world is responsible for that? Broadly, we have 2 sets of people. We have people that manage infrastructure, we have people that manage data. They're in the domains. Metadata is a data concern. So it's not the infrastructure people, because they care about infrastructure. So what we're now saying is someone in marketing, I'll pick marketing again, finance, operations, whatever, needs to understand the complexity of metadata synchronization between 2 disparate systems. And you know, quite frankly, that's a nonsense. So this is why I think interoperability is probably one of the most important things to think about when we think about technologies to support data mesh. The ability for things to work with the same security system, the same data catalog, and the same, in this case, technical metadata. There are other things that we need to think about as well, but I think these are the 3 kind of big ones in terms of interoperability. Let's go next slide. However, the reality is that most organizations do not start with no technology. They start with, you know, legacy platforms, or they start, you know, maybe they're multi-cloud, or, you know, maybe they're cloud on-prem or whatever. And so one approach, and I'm saying one approach because I work at Starburst, one approach is to use something like Starburst as a kind of virtualization across the kind of historic or legacy systems and the new systems, because everyone's always on a digital transformation journey. There are other approaches out there. There are things like Kafka for streaming data between, and CDC, and et cetera, and data replication. From what I've seen, data virtualization does simplify things in a lot of cases. There are other models out there, but this is something that is worth considering as one of your options for your technology infrastructure platform to support data mesh. And I'll hand over to Max. Apologies, I've gone a little over.
No worries, no worries. All right, so yeah, let's wrap it up with some of the key learnings, actually. And I want to especially focus on some pitfalls that we've seen in the past, and some of them that we have covered already, of course, as well as some best practices that we have seen to actually round up those things, right? So the first thing that I want to just briefly mention is don't overload your people. Right? Putting additional responsibilities on teams that are already overloaded will actually only create more burden, and will actually only like burn them out immediately, and will not net you any good results when it comes to that. Right? Don't create a platform with central data responsibility. Right? This is exactly the point that we mentioned in the past, that we mentioned before, that currently this is the state of the art for most of the data platforms that we have. But when you are actually reconstructing your data platform, your infrastructure platform, to help all these domain teams, don't make the same mistake again, and don't centralize responsibility about the data again in the platform side. At the same time, don't build the perfect platform up front. Yeah, like we have seen many cases where people came out with amazing like 3-year plans to construct the perfect platform, and by the time after 2 years or whatever, they realized that 50% of the stuff that they had in mind is already obsolete and is no longer needed. Take an iterative approach, build your platform as well as a product, and figure out what is actually needed across your company. And don't misunderstand the data mesh concept. It's a huge buzzword. Everybody loves talking about it, but nobody really understands what it actually means. Have in-depth discussion with the people around you to figure out what does it exactly mean in your company setup, so that you can figure out what it means. And on the best practices side, first of all, start small. Yeah, pick your use cases, pick your battles first, pick the first things that you actually want to focus on, and prove that it can be successful in your setup as well. At the same time, define your domains following your business capabilities. It's like similar to the KPI tree setup that Andy mentioned earlier. You want to make sure that you have your tech teams close to the business so that you really understand what is actually going on and what they are doing. Choose technology carefully. Yeah? Like really focus on the value, focus on the content of the data first before you dive into selecting the next big fancy technology and spreading your infrastructure landscape even further. And last but not least, evangelize data self-sufficiency. Make sure that the teams that are working with data are enabled to actually do so by themselves. That they have the tools at hand so that they can work with these things and that they can pick up the responsibility that we actually want to put on them. That's all that we had from our side. Thank you so much for sticking around. There will be a book signing session later today, so if you want to catch up with me, you will find me in the yellow suit anyways, but you will also find Andy at the Starburst booth if you have any follow-up questions on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you.